I had just clocked out from my second job that day, barely able to stand. 2 jobs, 7 days a week. All so my family could keep their home, their cars, their little luxuries. And then my body just gave out. I collapsed. In front of coworkers, in front of strangers. And when the ambulance came, I was still clutching my phone, trying to check if my sister's tuition had gone through. At the hospital, the doctor called my parents. He told them I had suffered neurological stress, possibly from overwork and lack of rest. You know what they said? She always exaggerates. She's probably just being dramatic again. They didn't show up, not a single one of them. But a few hours later, I got a text from my mom. Feel better tomorrow. Send me $1,000 for my spa. Oh, and don't forget the mortgage this month. That was the moment I realized I wasn't family. I was their wallet. What happened next, I smiled, and I started planning. If you've ever been the one who gives everything and gets nothing back, this story is for you. Because when I stopped saving them, everything they built fell apart. And I got everything they said I never would. Stay with me. Rachel Owens was 39 years old, unmarried, and completely invisible to the world she carried on her back. By day, she worked at a small community bank in the outskirts of Spokane, Washington, handling mortgages and small business accounts. By night, she took shifts at a local diner, the kind that smelled like old coffee and burnt bacon grease. No one asked her how she managed both jobs. They only asked for more. She had never been the daughter who sparkled in the family photos. That role belonged to Emily, her younger sister, now a single mother of a 5-year-old, and still treated like a princess. Their mother, Judith, insisted Rachel help cover Emily's daycare, her rent when she couldn't make it, and even her son's preschool tuition. You don't have a family of your own, Judith once said, waving a hand like that made it easier. So helping your sister is the least you can do. Rachel didn't argue. She didn't cry. She just nodded like always. She paid her father's medications every month. After his heart surgery 2 years ago, Rachel's paycheck became his lifeline. Their health insurance plan barely covered anything, but it didn't matter. Rachel made it work. She clipped coupons, she skipped lunch, she took double shifts. The mortgage was in her parents' name, but the monthly auto payment came out of Rachel's account. For the last 3 years, she'd been covering their loan while her mother focused on taking care of the home, and her father sat silently through it all. Rachel's name wasn't on the deed, only on the money. The demands never slowed. Every week there was something else Emily needed. New tires. Mom needed a new phone. Dad had another appointment. Rachel always said yes. She always figured out a way to squeeze a few more hours, cut a few more corners, shuffle just enough to stay barely breathing. It was a Tuesday night when her body finally gave out. She had worked 9 hours at the bank, skipped lunch to meet a mortgage client, then rushed straight to the diner for the closing shift. The place was short-staffed, and Rachel offered to stay late again. That night, the air felt heavier. Every breath came a little slower. Her hands trembled as she carried trays. Her knees buckled as she reached for silverware. She drank water, splashed her face, shook it off. Around midnight, while refilling coffee for a table of truckers, her vision blurred. The edges of the room closed in. Her heart pounded so hard it drowned out the voices around her. Then everything tilted sideways. The coffee pot slipped from her hand and shattered. Rachel hit the floor. Paramedics arrived within minutes. The manager called 911, then stood off to the side while the EMTs took her vitals. Her blood pressure was dangerously low. She was dehydrated, her pulse erratic. One of the paramedics guessed it was exhaustion, maybe even a mild stroke. Rachel couldn't speak. She barely remembered the ride to the hospital. In the ER, nurses moved quickly. Fluids were started, blood drawn. She drifted in and out, catching fragments of murmured concern from strangers. It was the first time in years someone took care of her without asking for something in return. When the doctor looked at her emergency contact, he dialed the only number listed, her mother's. "Hello, this is Dr. Larson from St. Clair's Medical. I'm calling regarding Rachel Owens. She's been brought in after collapsing at work." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then came the answer, flat and without hesitation. She's probably just being dramatic. She does that sometimes. The doctor frowned. Ma'am, she's unconscious. We suspect severe dehydration and possible neurological distress. I'm sure she'll be fine by morning, her mother interrupted. Just let her rest. It's not a big deal. Click. The call ended. No one else came. When Rachel regained consciousness 2 hours later, the room was dim. Her head pounded and her limbs felt like stone. She reached for her phone. No missed calls. No messages. Except one. From her mother. Hope you feel better tomorrow. Can you send me $1,000 spa appointments due? Also, don't forget about the house payment. Rachel stared at the screen. Her lips parted, but no sound came. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just lay there alone in that sterile white room with IV tubes in her arms and silence in her ears, realizing for the first time that maybe she didn't matter to them, not as a daughter, not as a sister, only as a wallet that happened to breathe. And now even that was breaking. Rachel woke to the soft hiss of oxygen through plastic tubing and the low hum of hospital machines. The light filtering in from the hallway was sterile and cold, casting pale shadows on the off-white walls. Her mouth was dry, her arms sore from the IVs, and her legs ached like she had climbed 100 stairs in her sleep. For a moment she wasn't sure where she was or how long she'd been there. Then it all came back. The diner. The coffee pot shattering. The floor rushing up to meet her. She turned her head slowly to the side. There was no one in the chair beside her bed. No flowers. No jacket draped over the armrest. No sign that anyone had been waiting. The only sounds were from the nurse's station outside and the faint beep of the heart monitor tracking her weary pulse. Rachel blinked at the ceiling, trying to process the emptiness. A part of her had hoped irrationally, foolishly, that someone might have come. Her mother, maybe. Or even Emily, just for appearance's sake. But the silence in the room told her everything. She reached for her phone on the tray table. The screen lit up. No missed calls, no voicemails, not even a single text asking if she was all right. Except one. It was from her mother, sent at 7:12 a.m. that morning, likely after the doctor's call. The message read, "Mai chakwe roy ha guime $1,000 di Spagna. Voi kadongtien gopnya zumelun." Rachel stared at the screen, her thumb hovering but not moving. There was no, "Are you okay?" Not even a question mark. Just the same transactional tone, like she were an app and someone had hit withdraw. Her lips curled slightly, but not into a smile. Just a quiet recognition of something she had refused to name for too long. She locked the phone and placed it face down on her stomach. After a while, she opened a browser and checked social media. She had forgotten to turn off notifications. The first story she saw was from Emily. It was a picture of a latte and a half-eaten croissant, with a caption written in curly pink font, "Drama Queen Strikes Again." Rachel read it twice just to be sure she hadn't misunderstood. The location tag showed a trendy brunch spot just a few blocks from their parents' home. She let the phone rest on her chest and closed her eyes. The ceiling above her looked the same as every hospital ceiling, square tiles, cold lights, no comfort. But today it felt like the only thing telling the truth. There was no fury in her, no tears. The pain wasn't sharp. It was hollow. Like something had slowly been scooped out of her over the years, and she was only just now noticing the space it left behind. For hours, nurses came and went. They adjusted her fluids, checked her vitals, asked if she needed anything. She answered politely, mechanically. She didn't ask for visitors. Didn't say a word about the phone call she knew the doctor had made. Because something in her already knew. Later that afternoon, a nurse with soft gray eyes came in with a clipboard. She smiled gently and said, "Your family hasn't arrived yet. Would you like us to call again?" Rachel looked at her, searching the woman's face for something sympathy maybe, or just some neutral human warmth. She shook her head. "No. Don't call." "They know." The nurse hesitated. "Are you sure? Sometimes people forget to check their phones." Rachel gave a faint, dry chuckle. No one forgot. My mother told the doctor not to worry, said I was faking it. The nurse blinked, unsure how to respond. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, deciding not to press further. She gave Rachel a soft pat on the arm and quietly stepped out. Rachel turned her face to the window. From where she lay, she could see only a sliver of sky gray, flat, unfeeling. The kind of sky that told you it might rain, but wouldn't promise when. In her mind, she replayed that phone call. She hadn't heard it, but she could imagine it so clearly. Her mother's tone, the dismissiveness, the way she would have waved a hand in the air while saying, "She does this sometimes." And worse, how she would have hung up without a second thought, maybe even annoyed the hospital had bothered her in the first place. Rachel thought about Emily's story again. She could practically hear her sister laughing with her phone held high, sipping overpriced coffee, mocking the sister who worked herself to collapse so they could live comfortably. They didn't know she had collapsed. They didn't even know she was in the hospital. Because her mother hadn't told them. Not even a word. Rachel let that realization settle like dust in her chest. It didn't crush her. It didn't surprise her. But it shifted something. Something deep. She had always suspected that her worth in the family was measured in dollars, that they saw her as convenient, dependable, useful. But now for the first time it was undeniable. She wasn't even worth a hospital visit, not worth a call, not worth a text that asked if she was all right, just a bill that forgot to pay itself. Rachel lay there for a long time unmoving. The IV dripped steadily. The monitor beeped. And the woman who had given everything to her family began to understand the most painful truth of all. They would never come. But the bills always would. Rachel had always known somewhere deep inside her that she was easy to forget. Lying in the hospital bed, her body still aching and her mind too tired to cry, the silence from her family wasn't a surprise. It wasn't even new. It was just a louder echo of something she had felt for as long as she could remember. When she was 8, she planned her own birthday party. She had colored hand-drawn invitations for her cousins and picked out a cake from the grocery store flyer. She told her mother all about it a week in advance. Judith nodded distracted and said, "We'll see." The day came and went without candles. No balloons. No one even said the words "Happy Birthday." That afternoon, her mother left early to help Emily get ready for a party. Emily's new boyfriend was having a barbecue, and they couldn't show up empty-handed. Rachel sat on the porch, her little paper crown wilting in the heat, the store-bought cake untouched in the fridge. There had been no apology, no makeup celebration, just a casual shrug. Days later. "Well, you'll have another one next year." Years passed and the pattern stayed the same. When she was 17, Rachel was in her first car accident. A minor fender bender on a slick road. The front of her car was crumpled, her hands shaking when she called home from the payphone outside the mechanic's garage. Her voice trembled. Her mother answered, and Rachel said, "I think I need help," before she could finish. Judith cut in. "Is the car totaled? You know how much that costs?" Rachel swallowed hard. Her neck hurt, and she wasn't sure if she should go to the ER. But when her mother arrived, she only circled the car, muttering about deductibles and insurance. "You really should have braked sooner," she scolded. "This is why you need to be more careful." Rachel never told her how long it took to sleep without flinching at every sound after that. When she was 24, Rachel sat across the kitchen table from her mother and tried just once to explain what it felt like to live with the weight in her chest that wouldn't go away. "I think something's wrong," she whispered. "I feel low, like I can't breathe sometimes, like I'm not really here." Her mother didn't even look up from the coupons she was clipping. "Don't be ridiculous. You always were dramatic. That's not depression, that's you trying to get out of chores." Rachel never brought it up again. The hospital room faded behind her eyes as these memories washed over her. Not in a wave, but like rain on a windshield, soft, steady, impossible to ignore. She thought of her grandfather then. He had been the only one who ever looked her in the eye and really saw her. She remembered sitting on his lap listening to the ticking of his old watch and the way he smelled of aftershave and tobacco. He used to hum old tunes and say, "You've got more heart than this whole family combined." When she was 12, he told her that if she ever needed a place to go, his cabin in the woods was always open. "It's your haven," he said, kissing her forehead, "no matter what they say." But then suddenly the visits stopped. Her mother said he was too sick, too tired. "He doesn't want company," Judith insisted. "He asked for rest." Rachel had wanted to call him to write, but somehow the number was always lost, or the letters never reached him. And she, obedient as always, believed her. Until now. Now, with nothing but hospital linens and the dim light of regret, the pieces started to shift. The distance, the silence, the things left unsaid. Rachel felt the weight of it land squarely in her chest. It was not just neglect. It had been intentional. She thought again of that day at 13 when she caught a glimpse of her grandfather's handwriting on a letter on the kitchen table. Judith had quickly swept it up and tucked it into her purse. "Not for you," she said, walking away. Rachel had forgotten about that moment, or maybe buried it. But now something inside her stirred. A letter, written to her, hidden for 2 decades. She didn't have proof, not yet, but she knew. She knew it in the same quiet, aching way she had known every time she was left behind. Every time her pain was dismissed, every time her mother looked at Emily like she was the prize and Rachel the burden. She turned her head slowly, looking at the door. Still, no one came. Not her mother. Not Emily. Not even a call. But in that moment, Rachel began to remember who she really was, before the silence, before the sacrifice, before she was taught to disappear. And for the first time in a very long time, she didn't feel ashamed of being forgotten. She felt angry. And something more dangerous, she felt ready. Rachel was discharged on a cloudy Thursday afternoon. The nurse wheeled her to the entrance with soft encouragement and a clipboard of aftercare instructions, but no one stood waiting on the curb. She had called a cab herself. She didn't expect anyone to come. Not anymore. The ride back to her apartment was silent. She stared out the window at the dull streets of Spokane rolling by, everything so familiar but newly hollow. The cab dropped her off in front of the small building she'd lived in for nearly a decade. A place no one in her family had ever visited. Inside, the first thing she did was set her phone on the kitchen counter. Still no missed calls. Still no apologies. Only a new text from her mother sent that morning. "You feeling better yet? Rent's due Friday. Don't forget." Rachel didn't reply. She went to her laptop, opened her bank account, and clicked through the automatic payments. For years, they had gone out like clockwork. The mortgage payment to her parents' lender, the tuition for her nephew's preschool, the utilities for the house she didn't live in. All quietly deducted from her salary before she ever had a chance to think about it. She hovered over each one, hand steady. Cancel. 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 She didn't tell anyone. That evening she sat by the window with a cup of tea and waited. It didn't take long. At 9:43 p.m. her phone buzzed. A text from Emily. "Hey, weird the preschool bounced your payment. Did your card change?" Rachel didn't respond. At 10:12 p.m. another from her mother. "Mortgage didn't go through. What's going on?" At 10:45 p.m. "Thang ne konguya. May doi doi kizite." "No. Are you okay?" "No, we're sorry." Just confusion. Entitlement. Frustration that their machine had stopped running. Rachel put the phone on silent and turned it face down. The next morning, she did something she hadn't done in years. She walked into a therapy office. It wasn't easy. The building was small, tucked between a dry cleaner and a dentist's office, and she sat in her car for 15 minutes before she got out. But she went in. The therapist's name was Carla, a woman in her 60s with gentle eyes and a voice that didn't rush. Rachel didn't tell her everything in that first session. She didn't talk about the collapse or the hospital or the years of invisibility. Not yet. But she did talk about the exhaustion, about how tired she was of always being the one who carried everything while being treated like nothing. And Carla nodded, said softly, "That sounds incredibly lonely." Rachel didn't cry. but her voice broke once on the word used. The session ended. She booked another. That weekend, Rachel got paid from the bank job, the first full paycheck she hadn't immediately divvied up for someone else. She stared at it sitting in her account. It looked strange. Whole. For a moment, she felt guilty. Then she remembered the text from her mother. The messages that had piled up in her phone, not one of them asking how she felt. So she closed the browser, and she drove to a little antique store she used to walk past on the way to work. There, tucked in the corner behind an old oak bookshelf, was a reading chair, overstuffed, slightly faded, and exactly the one she had stopped to admire 3 years earlier. Back then, she hadn't even asked the price. Emily needed new snow tires that month. Her dad's pills were overdue. But now, standing there with sunlight slanting through the dusty windows, she asked. The price wasn't cheap, but it wasn't impossible either. It was hers. She bought it. Had it delivered the next day. That night she sat in it with a blanket and a paperback legs curled under her tea in hand, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she didn't feel like she owed anyone anything. No guilt, no pressure, no invisible leash, just a chair, a quiet apartment, and the slow, strange feeling of being free. The first letter came in a pale blue envelope marked urgent. It was addressed to her parents, but Rachel recognized the logo stamped in the corner. It belonged to the mortgage lender. She had seen enough of them over the years to know the pattern. 2 months behind. Rachel hadn't said a word when she canceled the autopay from her account. She owed no explanation. For years, she had let the lender pull directly from her checking balance because her parents had failed a credit check, and her name, her bank job, had given the application just enough credibility to push it through. She wasn't on the loan, not technically, but she had enabled it. Quietly. Out of guilt, maybe. Or habit. Or just exhaustion. Now the payments had stopped. The second letter came 4 days later. A late fee. Then the phone calls started. They didn't call to ask if she was okay. No one called to ask how she was recovering or whether she needed anything. They called because the house they loved to say was their legacy, was in trouble. Not once did they say thank you for the years she had kept that roof over their heads. The first voicemail was from her mother. Rachel, what is going on with the mortgage? We just got a warning letter. You can't just stop payments without telling us. This is serious. Rachel deleted it. Then Emily. Mom says the bank's threatening penalties. You can't just drop this on us. You've always handled it. Why now? There was no trace of worry for Rachel's well-being, no acknowledgement that she had landed in the hospital collapsed from the very burden they were now scrambling to carry. Only outrage that the machine had stopped working. By the end of the week, there were 12 missed calls, 5 voicemails, 1 group text, all caps, Rachel, you're being selfish. She didn't answer. Instead, she made an appointment with a lawyer. The office was in an old brick building downtown with ivy crawling up the outside and thick glass windows that kept out the noise of the street. The attorney, a woman named Lisa Conway, wore round glasses and spoke with calm precision. Rachel explained everything: how she had signed no loan documents, how the bank had used her account only through verbal authorization, how she had never co-owned the house, but had been treated like she did. Lisa listened, took notes, and nodded thoughtfully. You want to formally revoke any implied financial responsibility, she said. Terminate all authorizations, clean break. Rachel nodded. Lisa smiled, not unkindly. It's about time. They drafted a letter of revocation addressed to the mortgage lender, explicitly ending any association Rachel's account had with that property. They sent copies to the utility companies, the school that billed her for her nephew's tuition, and even to the homeowner's insurance firm that still had her listed as a contact. Within days, her inbox started filling with confirmations. Autopay canceled. Authorization removed. Your name has been disassociated from this account. Each one felt like a small exhale she hadn't known she was holding. Then came the final step. Lisa filed a notice with the bank stating that Rachel was not a legal party to the loan, nor responsible for payment, and that any future attempts to link her to the account would be considered financial harassment. It was clean, clear, irrevocable. Rachel walked out of the office and sat in her car, hands on the wheel, not moving. For years she had existed in the space between compliance and invisibility. She had been the one who filled the fridge, paid the bills, smoothed the cracks while they called her ungrateful, overdramatic, selfish, whenever she so much as slowed down. Now, for the first time, she had removed her name, not just from the bank account, from the entire arrangement. That night, her mother left another voicemail. "This is really happening, isn't it? The bank says you're not on anything anymore. We didn't think you'd go that far." Rachel didn't listen to the rest. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat back in her reading chair. The one she bought with her own money for her own space and her own time. The house might still stand for now, but for the first time, it wasn't propped up by her. The call came on a rainy morning 2 weeks after Rachel had filed her final paperwork with the attorney. She almost didn't answer. The number was unfamiliar from a small town several hours north. Something about it made her pause. "This is Rachel Owens," she said cautiously. The voice on the other end was deep measured. "Ms. Owens, my name is Franklin Reed. I'm the attorney who handled your grandfather's estate." Rachel froze. "I understand you and your grandfather were close some years ago," he continued. "He passed nearly 8 months ago, but certain personal items and property were left outside the primary will to be communicated privately." Rachel swallowed. She had heard about her grandfather's passing through, Emily casually mentioned in a group text about scheduling Thanksgiving. No funeral invite, no direct message. She hadn't even known when or where he was buried. "I'm calling," Mr. Reed said, "because your grandfather left you something. A small cabin. In his own words, for Rachel only." Rachel didn't speak for a long moment. She thought of the lap she used to sit on the watch that ticked the quiet humming voice that once said she had more heart than the rest of them combined. "Where is it?" she finally asked. "Near Mount Fernridge," he replied. "It's a remote property, not large but structurally sound. He kept it well maintained. I've mailed you the deed, but I'd encourage you to see it." 3 days later, Rachel drove north through winding roads that led into the mountains. The sky cleared as she ascended. Pines lined the road like quiet witnesses. She remembered the place vaguely, a single trip as a child bundled in a scarf chasing pine cones while her grandfather chopped wood. The driveway was little more than gravel and grass now, but the cabin stood humble and square, its roof shingled in green, a thin chimney curling smoke into the autumn air. The key was tucked behind a stone, just like he used to tell her. Rachel stepped inside. Dust motes floated in the shafts of light that filtered through the windows. The place smelled of cedar and thyme. There was no electricity yet, no modern fixtures. Just old furniture, bookshelves, a wood stove, and quiet. The kind of quiet that didn't feel empty. It felt full. She stood in the center of the room and let herself breathe in a way she hadn't in years. The next morning she swept the floors. By noon she was scrubbing windows. That weekend she hauled in sacks of soil and bought seedlings from the roadside nursery, thyme, basil, lavender. A week later she brought in shelves and filled them with used books from the town's second-hand store. She let herself rise with the sun, walk in the woods, forget her phone for hours at a time. No one from her family called anymore, not even to ask where she was. The mortgage warnings had stopped coming to her inbox. Her bank account no longer buzzed with withdrawals. Her name was finally hers again. On the third Sunday afternoon, while cleaning out the narrow loft above the cabin's sleeping nook, she found a small wooden box tucked beneath an old quilt. It was wrapped in twine, worn but intact. Inside was a letter. The handwriting was unmistakable, her grandfather's. It was addressed simply, "To Rachel. In case they never let me tell you." Her hands shook as she unfolded the paper. "I wanted you to have something that no one could take, not even them. They've tried to silence you, Rachel, to shape you into what they needed. But I saw you. Always. The way you carried their weight. The way they pretended not to notice. This cabin is yours. It was always meant to be. Not just the land, the quiet, the space to remember yourself. You are not selfish for needing peace. You are not wrong for wanting to be free. They will never understand what you gave, but I do, and I love you more for it. Grandpa Rachel pressed the paper to her chest, her eyes burning but dry. It wasn't just a gift. It was proof. Proof that someone had seen the years she gave, the pain she swallowed, the weight she bore without thanks. And now, for the first time, she had a place that was only hers. No demands, no guilt. Just light through the trees, wind in the pines, and the echo of a man who had never stopped believing in her. It started with a voicemail longer than the others, out of breath, nearly frantic. "Rachel, it's Emily. Call me back, okay? It's about Grandpa. He's in the hospital. It's bad. Just, please call." Rachel listened, then locked her phone without responding. She'd been pruning the small patch of lavender in front of the cabin when it rang. The sun had just crested over the treetops, and the scent of pine mixed with the soft sweetness of herbs. Birds were chattering somewhere nearby. She had felt peaceful until that voicemail pierced through the quiet. The second message came an hour later. This time her mother, "Rachel, pick up. I don't care what this grudge is. Your grandfather's dying and he asked for you." By nightfall, the phone had registered over 20 missed calls. By morning, it was past 50, and still not one of them said "I'm sorry." Not for the years, not for the silence, not for the text messages demanding money while she lay unconscious, not for forgetting every birthday, not for erasing every cry for help. They didn't want her back. They wanted something else. Rachel sat by the window with a cup of tea and watched as the screen lit up again. 74 missed calls, then 91, then 120, all from two people. Emily, Judith. One message simply read, "You win. Happy now." Another. "He won't sign anything until he sees you. What did you say to him?" And that was the truth of it, wasn't it? They weren't worried about Grandpa's final wishes out of love. They were terrified of what he might leave behind and who he might leave it to. Rachel didn't answer. She didn't need to. She knew her grandfather, knew the way his quiet affections had always been sincere, knew the way he looked at her when she was small and trying not to cry, knew he had always seen through the noise. He was the only one who had ever said, "You don't owe them everything." She pulled the box of old letters from beneath her reading chair, the one she had filled with scraps of memory since moving into the cabin. Folded corners, dusty envelopes, receipts from moments that had mattered only to her. Near the bottom, she found something she hadn't noticed before. A printed email. Faint ink creased once across the center. No envelope, no handwriting, just a subject line. "I miss you, kiddo." It was dated nearly 10 years ago, from his personal email address. She stared at the date, then the body of the message. "Rachel. Your mom says you're busy and don't want to talk, but I don't believe that. I think you don't know I've been writing, so I'm trying this instead. If you ever want to get away, the cabin's still yours. Always was. I left something there for you. You don't have to answer. I just want you to know someone still thinks about you every day. Love, Grandpa." Rachel read it twice, 3 times. Then the realization hit her like cold water. She had never seen this email before. She remembered that year. The job at the bank had just started. She had been swamped, yes, but she always checked her inbox. There had been nothing. Not a single message from him. She had assumed wrongly that he had simply stopped reaching out. But he hadn't. Her mother had. The email must have come to the shared family account back when they still used the same computer. Judith must have opened it, deleted it, printed it out for herself, maybe out of guilt, maybe to hide it from Emily. Either way, she had never meant for Rachel to read it. But here it was sitting in her hands 10 years too late. Rachel folded it gently and placed it with the letter she'd found in the cabin weeks before. There were no tears, just a quiet, pulsing truth growing stronger in her chest. She had never been forgotten. She had been kept away. She looked out the window again. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows through the trees. Somewhere in a hospital bed, the only person who had ever loved her without conditions might be saying her name. But she wasn't ready to go back. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The hospital lights buzzed faintly above her as Rachel stepped through the sliding glass doors. The sterile air hit her first dry and sharp smelling of antiseptic and quiet panic. She didn't ask the nurse at the desk for directions. She already knew the floor. Room 426, ICU. She hadn't come for closure. She hadn't come for forgiveness. She came for him. Her boots echoed down the hallway, steady and unhurried. At the end of the corridor just outside the room stood her mother and Emily, shoulders tight, eyes swollen but still brimming with something other than sorrow. Panic, perhaps. Or fear. They froze when they saw her. Judith's voice cracked first. "You came." Rachel didn't stop walking. Emily stepped forward. "We've been calling, he's been asking for you. You should have come sooner." Rachel met her gaze with a calm she didn't recognize in herself. "You didn't want me here. You wanted what you thought I was holding." Emily flinched but said nothing. Rachel turned to her mother, whose lips were pressed into a thin line. "I'm not here for either of you," Rachel said. "I'm here for him. And I won't stay long." Judith tried to speak, but Rachel raised a hand. "You know," Rachel said, her voice low but clear, "I used to think I was just difficult. Oversensitive. The problem child. But now I see it. I wasn't hard to love. I was just inconvenient to care about." Her mother's eyes narrowed. "Don't start." "No," Rachel said, her tone firmer now. "You don't get to rewrite it. I spent years sending money, answering every request. And the one time I collapsed, you said I was pretending." Emily crossed her arms, scoffing. "You're being dramatic again." Rachel reached into her bag and pulled out a thin folder. She handed it to Emily. Inside were copies of bank statements, email printouts, one form in particular, the application for a credit card issued 5 years ago under Rachel's name but signed by someone else. "Remember this?" she asked. Emily paled. "I found the charges months ago. Spa visits, designer bags, groceries I never bought. I confronted the bank and they investigated quietly. I chose not to press charges because I didn't want to humiliate the family." She looked at her mother. "I chose silence. Again. But silence isn't love, and enabling isn't loyalty." Judith opened her mouth, but Rachel shook her head. "You don't get to be surprised. You taught me how to disappear." "And I did." She turned toward the door but paused before pushing it open. "You once called me a burden," Rachel said softly. "But the truth is, I was the foundation. You just never bothered to look beneath your feet." She stepped inside the room. It was dim and still, the only sound the steady beeping of a monitor. Her grandfather looked smaller than she remembered. Fragile, but peaceful. She pulled up a chair and took his hand. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then his eyes fluttered open. He blinked slowly, then smiled, a real smile, one that reached through the fog. "Rachel," he whispered. "You came." She nodded, eyes wet but calm. "I'm sorry it took so long," she said. He squeezed her hand, faint but certain. "I knew you would." Then, with a quiet breath, he closed his eyes again. And this time he didn't open them. His chest rose once more, then stilled. The monitor didn't wail. It simply slowed, faded. Rachel sat there, hand still in his, and let the silence settle. He hadn't needed words. He had waited for her, and now he could rest. The office was quiet, the kind of quiet that came with thick carpeting, heavy wood furniture, and the hush of uncomfortable anticipation. Rachel sat in the far corner of the conference room, her hands folded in her lap. The leather chair beneath her creaked softly each time she shifted, but she didn't move much, Across from her sat her mother, rigid and unsmiling, and Emily, arms crossed, jaw-clenched fingers tapping the table in an impatient rhythm. The tension between them wasn't new. But today it had form, shape, weight. At the head of the table, Mr. Franklin Reed, her grandfather's attorney, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. A stack of folders lay in front of him. A sealed envelope rested on top. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice even. "This won't take long." He opened the envelope, removed a single sheet of paper, and began reading aloud. "I, Edward Milton Owens, being of sound mind and body, hereby declare this my final will and testament." Rachel listened, still her eyes on the table. "To my granddaughter, Rachel Ann Owens, I leave full possession of my property at Fernridge Mountain, including the cabin and all land contained therein, along with the financial account attached to said property, which contains a balance of $148,000. Emily sucked in a sharp breath. Judith's head jerked slightly, eyes narrowing. "To my daughter, Judith Owens, and granddaughter, Emily Owens, I leave no financial inheritance. This decision is final and made with full consideration." Silence. Mr. Reed looked up from the page, his expression unreadable. "That concludes the formal reading." Judith stood abruptly. "That can't be right." Emily's voice followed sharper. "He was on medication. He wasn't thinking clearly. This must be a mistake." Mr. Reed didn't flinch. "The document was witnessed, notarized, and updated 6 months ago. He was of sound mind. There are recordings if necessary and a medical attestation." Judith's face reddened. "This is absurd. He wouldn't do that. Not to us." Rachel didn't look at her. She didn't need to. Emily pushed back from the table. "You manipulated him. You waited until he was old and vulnerable." Rachel finally raised her eyes. They were calm. "I didn't have to manipulate anyone," she said. "He saw everything long before I did." Judith pointed a finger across the table. "You think this makes you better than us? That money, that land, it was never really yours." Rachel stood slowly. "You're right. For most of my life it wasn't. None of it was. Not the money, not the support, not the respect. But that was your choice." She turned to Mr. Reed, who nodded and slid a small envelope toward her. "There's one final item," he said. "He left this for you personally." Rachel took it gently and tucked it into her coat pocket. She didn't look at Judith or Emily again. Outside, the wind had picked up. It whispered through the pine trees that lined the sidewalk, brushing the hem of Rachel's coat as she walked back to her car. She sat behind the wheel, hands resting on the steering wheel, for a long time before she opened the envelope. Inside was a photograph. Faded slightly with age, but still clear. She was 7, sitting on her grandfather's lap on the steps of the cabin. Her hair was in braids. He was laughing, his arms wrapped tightly around her as she held up a wildflower bouquet with both hands. She didn't even remember the photo being taken. On the back, in his uneven handwriting, were just 10 words. "When the world forgets you, this place remembers you." Rachel pressed the photo to her chest and let the warmth of it sink in. He had always seen her, and now so did the world. The email came from the mortgage company, Standard Short Impersonal. Just a confirmation that the foreclosure process had been finalized and the property at 218 Linden Lane had been repossessed by the bank. Rachel stared at it on her screen for a moment, then clicked archive without reading the rest. She didn't feel triumph, not satisfaction, not even anger. It just felt like math. There had been payments. Then there hadn't. And now there was no house. She had expected the fallout to be louder. Maybe another storm of texts, maybe accusations. But for a while there was silence. Until one morning, after feeding the birds outside her window and making tea, she opened her phone to check the weather and found a video link sent by a former co-worker from the bank. "Have you seen this?" it read. Rachel hesitated, then clicked. It was Emily. Sitting on the stoop of a generic apartment complex, puffy-eyed hair disheveled just enough to look tragic on camera. The caption at the bottom read, "Homeless because my sister abandoned us." Rachel's breath caught, not from shock, but from the sheer gall of it. The video started with a sigh. "My mom and I have been through so much." Emily began, her voice cracking in well-timed waves. "We lost our home, everything, because the one person we thought we could count on just cut us off. Out of nowhere. No warning. She just stopped helping. She knew we couldn't survive without her, and she didn't care." Behind her, Judith sat silent, staring at the ground, the very image of a broken woman. "She says we used her," Emily continued. "But what kind of daughter abandons her own mother and her nephew? For what revenge?" The video cut to a close-up of Emily wiping her nose. "We're just trying to get back on our feet. If anyone can help even a little, it would mean everything." Rachel looked at the view count. Over 200,000. The comments were full of sympathy, sending love and prayers. "Just donated, stay strong. Your sister sounds heartless." Rachel scrolled through the attached link, a donation site with a photo of the house they'd lost framed to look quaint, like something precious torn away too soon. The goal was $15,000. They'd already raised half in 2 days. She closed her eyes, leaned back in her chair, and let the anger rise, crest, and settle. It didn't stay long. She clicked the Save Video option, archived the link, took a screenshot of the donation page, organized them all in a private folder on her desktop labeled simply Noise. Then she locked her phone, stood up, and walked outside. The afternoon air was cool and full of pine. Her small garden had begun to take shape, lavender on one side, rosemary and thyme along the path to the back shed. She adjusted a loose plank on the porch and sat on the steps, letting the wind play with her hair. She didn't post a rebuttal. She didn't comment. She didn't reach out to explain or defend or justify. Let them talk. Let the world believe what it wanted. She had spent enough years arguing for her own worth, explaining pain to people who refused to hear it. This time she would let silence speak for her. The cabin didn't care what TikTok thought, and for the first time in her life, neither did she. Spring came slowly to the mountains. It arrived first in the scent of damp earth, then in the way the morning light lingered longer on the windowsill. Rachel noticed it not with excitement, but with quiet recognition, like an old friend returning after too long. She had planted rosemary and sage along the path leading from the porch. Lavender bloomed in patches along the fence, humming softly with bees in the late afternoon. The tomatoes had taken longer, but now the first green bulbs were pushing through. Inside the cabin had become a kind of sanctuary. She rearranged the bookshelves until they felt just right, stocked the kitchen with copper pots she found at the town flea market, and built a reading nook by the window that caught the sunrise. A gray cat had begun appearing at her doorstep. At first it came only for scraps, then for warmth, and eventually for company. She named him Finch. Rachel began to walk more often, alone at first, then sometimes with neighbors she'd come to know. Retired teachers, local artists, widows who brought homemade bread in exchange for cut herbs. She didn't share much about her past. They didn't ask. She read before bed instead of checking her phone. She wrote lists of things she wanted to learn: how to make jam, how to split firewood properly, how to play the piano again. She bought herself a birthday present for the first time in years, a thick wool shawl in the exact shade of forest green she loved as a child, but was always told made her look washed out. One Tuesday in late April, she checked the mailbox and found a single envelope cream-colored with gold edging. Her name was written on the front in her mother's slanted handwriting. She carried it inside and sat down at the kitchen table. Finch jumped into her lap and settled his weight against her legs. The envelope wasn't sealed. Inside was a card blue with tiny embossed butterflies. On the inside flap in her mother's script was a single line: "Happy birthday, Beut Kwame." No apology, no explanation, just a line from a woman who had used that phrase her entire life and only when she needed something. Rachel looked at it for a long time. Then she closed the card gently and placed it on the bookshelf between a collection of short stories and a guide to mountain herbs. She didn't throw it away. She didn't rip it in half. She just left it there unopened, resting in the quiet space she had made for things that no longer needed answers. She stood and walked out to the porch where the late sun was casting golden stripes across the floorboards. Finch followed, curling around her ankles before settling on the first step. The breeze carried the faint scent of pine and wild mint. Birds chattered somewhere near the edge of the trees. Rachel pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders and closed her eyes. There was no ache anymore. No gnawing voice in her head asking why or what if. Just silence. Soft, clean silence. She smiled. Not from relief, not from revenge, just from peace. The light was softer in the late afternoons now. It slid through the tall trees in golden threads, casting dappled patterns on the worn wood of the porch. Rachel sat quietly in her chair, wrapped in her green shawl, a mug of chamomile tea warming her hands. Finch lay curled at her feet, his breathing slow and steady, in perfect rhythm, with the breeze rustling the trees. It had been almost a year since she moved into the cabin. She had stopped counting time by months. Now it passed by other measures, how tall the time had grown, how many books she'd finished, how early the birds started singing. Some mornings she'd wake up and forget for a blissful second that her life had ever been anything else but this. That was the greatest gift of all. There were still echoes, of course. Habits, instincts, the urge to check bank accounts, to brace for requests, to apologize for not responding fast enough. But they faded faster now. Each time they returned, she met them with stillness. They could not survive where no one was feeding them. The phone buzzed on the small table beside her. Rachel didn't jump. She glanced toward it with the same energy she gave to a leaf falling from the roof. It wasn't a call this time. Just an email notification, the subject line briefly glowing on the screen before fading back into quiet. She didn't need to read the sender. She already knew. Judith Owens. The subject line. Help us. Rachel's breath caught not from fear or sadness or even pity, but because once upon a time those two words would have sent her running. Once upon a time she would have thrown off her shawl, reached for her bag, opened her laptop, made a plan. She would have gone back and lost herself again. Instead, she looked at the phone. She reached out not to open the message, but to gently place the phone face down on the table. Then she exhaled. A long, quiet breath that emptied from somewhere deep in her ribs. It rolled out through her lips like a final chapter closing with grace. Not vengeance. Not triumph, just peace. She looked out toward the woods where the trees shimmered in the gold of a day almost done. Birds flitted between branches. Finch let out a sigh and stretched his back legs before resettling. Somewhere inside the kettle clicked off. Rachel didn't move. She didn't need to. The world could knock. She didn't have to answer. And in the quiet of that moment, with the wind brushing softly against her skin, a thought rose up, not sharp, like anger, not heavy, like grief. Just a simple truth, as clean and certain as the mountain air. I didn't get revenge. I just stopped. And when I stopped, they finally started to pay. The light faded. The trees whispered. Rachel closed her eyes and let the silence speak for her. If this story stayed with you, if you felt something shift while listening to Rachel's journey, then take a second to subscribe to the channel. There are more stories like this. Stories of quiet strength, of finding peace when the world refuses to give it. And I want to hear from you. What would you have done in Rachel's place? Would you have answered that message or walked away like she did? Leave a comment below. Your thoughts might be exactly what someone else needs to read today.